is a well-proven solution to a commonplace problem in a specific context. And they were invented by a civil architect, a gentleman named Christopher Alexander, but they were adopted by the software community back in the 90s. And so most of these guys came from there. This is a stand-up that happened at the end of the very first Agile conference, XP 2000. And the picture, I forgot to say, the picture was taken by Martin Fowler. So we've got maybe half of the Agile Manifesto signatories at this place. Oh, and this bloke here, very handsome fellow wearing shorts. I had dark hair then, that was me. So it was an extraordinary event. We had about 200 people, maybe about as many as we'll have listening in today. But no one there had ever heard of Scrum. Well, okay, that's telling a slight lie. Maybe that Ward and Kent had heard of Scrum, but most of us, we just thought about XP. That was mainstream Agile at the time. And Dave Thomas, this Dave Thomas, turned up to this stand-up with a little pamphlet that he had gotten from IBM, from the Rational group, had been bought by IBM. And it explained about how the next version of the Rational Unified Process would do extreme programming. And he said, fellas, we got to rebrand this thing. We can't keep calling it extreme, because these guys, they're just going to eat our lunch. They've got a multi-million-dollar marketing department. There's just a bunch of us standing in the middle of the Mediterranean. We've got to come up with something better. And so this was actually the meeting at which the word Agile was born. Now, I don't know if it was absolutely the moment, because there are a couple of people who've laid claim to it. My recollection is it was Alistair Coburn, but he might have been repeating an idea from someone else. He claims it wasn't him. In any case, point is, there were a lot of ideas that at the time were extremely important to us, that these days have become a little bit rarefied. It's difficult to find these ideas. They're not really brought together. They're not well organized. And because they're not, and because Scrum and SAFe have become such dominant forces and have not multi-million-dollar marketing departments, multi-billion-dollar marketing departments, I thought, from the point of view of the Sberbank Scrum Masters, maybe we can bring a little bit of value from last century, from an old guy with gray hair, and look at maybe some of these ideas are not just still useful, but actually more useful than the established, accepted wisdom. So, oh, I should also mention the deck you have for this. Actually, I'll go back one. So you have a PDF of this. It's under the Creative Commons NCND license. So you can't chop it up or sell it, but you can certainly circulate it if you find it useful. So the first idea that was almost an assumption for us at the time. It was given a name in Apple under Steve Jobs, directly responsible individuals. And the idea was very simple. Committees, where people vote on decisions, tend to wind up with compromises in politics. So the idea with the DRIs is that whenever a meeting was held in Apple, whoever held the meeting would have to publish an agenda. And every agenda item had to have someone's name against it as the person who was going to be responsible for execution of whatever decision came out of that meeting. So very, very simple idea. But Jobs and everybody in Apple they were ruthless about throwing people out of meetings if they were not the DRI for one of the agenda items. And they generally stuck to a weekly cadence in their meetings, and there's a pretty good reason for that we will talk about a little bit later. Some of you might be more comfortable with 2 or 3 or even 4 weeks. The fact is, if we're really going to get business agility in the way we do our work, which is to say, the capability to respond to changing market conditions, we're going to need tight loops. And to get tight loops, we're going to need small teams. So the idea of throwing people out, if they're just there to listen or if they are just there to exert authority, we don't need people who are not going to take part in actually reaching some decisions. And whoever called the meeting, they're going to have a special role in the way they play, because that's the way we have been doing things in, oh, I forgot to say something about me beyond that I was standing in the Mediterranean. So I'm the founder of a Linux-style ecosystem of independent, seasoned, senior agile coaches. For myself, I got most of my start in software engineering. For maybe 30 years, I was hardcore technical. And then people started paying me more money to coach agile than to be an architect or a manager. Most of it, I wasn't a manager anyway, but after a while, I realized that I'd learned enough that I needed to start bringing some of these ideas to the culture. So the name of the ecosystem I mentioned is called Xscale Alliance. Xscale is a toolkit, not a framework of ideas. And we're going to look at some of those ideas, but only just a few of them at a team level today. Most of its focus is business agility, whole organizations, and actually business agility first. But there's a bunch of ideas in there that are directly useful to Scrum Masters. So the intent is to share these ideas and then do a bit of a Q&A afterwards. For me, while I've been doing this work since before Agile was called Agile, that doesn't mean anything about the value of the ideas. So I want you to be very skeptical. Don't just take it from me. I'm going to try and talk about some of the real world examples of where we've used these things, but some of the examples that I draw on things where these things were ridiculously successful outside of my direct experience. I'm happy to talk about both. Anyway, enough of this one. I should say this first pattern and the next two, they form something called a pattern language, which is to say a set of patterns where each pattern solves a problem, but also creates problems that are solved by the other patterns in the language. It sounds like a very complicated thing. You could think it's like having a toolbox with a hammer and a saw and a screwdriver. You kind of need to have at least those tools to be able to do a bit of carpentry around the house. That kind of toolkit idea, to my mind, is a better way of talking about these patterns than a language, which sounds very fancy. So, balance of powers. It sounds like something governments do. It's a very simple idea, and most likely you already have a direct experience of this idea. You know, if you are running a planning poker game, I don't know if you use planning poker or not, but if you run a planning poker game and you run a couple of rounds of planning poker, but the team is not gelling on a single estimate. Maybe some of them say that the story or backlog item, whatever you call it, is a 3, and some say it's a 13, and they just can't get together. Well, as a Scrum Master, you have 3 choices, and 2 of the choices are stupid, and the third choice is balance of powers. So I'll come back to that. The first 2, the stupid ones, well, you could do some voting. You could say, well, how many people want 3? How many people want 13? Oh, it's 13. You will always get bad estimates this way. You really want people to figure out why this difference and make trade-offs. You could say, well, let's average. We'll do a weighted average of the 3 and the 13, and we'll get maybe 8 or maybe 5. This will also produce very bad estimates. Now, obviously, sometimes you might go, we don't do planning poker. We don't use story points. We use stories. That's okay. You still have to make decisions about how to break things down into similar sized stories. this pattern still turns up there too. So the third pattern is you go, okay, I'm a Scrum Master. This is mainly a database story. Jill is our database architect. So if the rest of you cannot agree in the next 2-3 minutes, I will just ask Jill for her estimate and I'll go with what she says. So the neat thing about this very simple pattern is now everybody else on the team has a motivation to make trade-offs. Because if they can't get to an agreement, then Jill is going to take the estimate away from them. They're still going to wind up doing the work. So this is balance of powers. The idea is that the DRIs, Jill, can still influence the decision. If everybody except for you and Jill is unanimous that they want to do things a certain way, they want it to be a 3, if it's an estimate, or maybe it's a decision about what kind of metadata we're going to be using, or which database are we going to be using, SQL Server or Oracle or one of the NoSQL databases, whatever the decision is. If everybody apart from Jill is unanimous, then Jill has not been able to convince any one of them. Well, then they overrule Jill. If, on the other hand, they are not unanimous, they are locked up, and they are locked up past the deadline that you set, well then, we'll go with Jill's estimate. Now, the funny thing about this pattern, which it crops up in planning poker so often, I would be amazed if you haven't tried it or seen it. The funny thing is, this works for all kinds of decisions at all kinds of levels. It works for PMOs, it works for boards, C-suites, you name it. And it's a pattern that was used by this group of people, Native American Indians, for 500 years as part of something called the Great Law of Peace, which we're not going to talk about now. So, simple pattern, just like the first one was a simple pattern, but very effective because it solves a commonplace problem in a context that we all share. So, third pattern in this pattern language, in this toolkit. This is a very funny title, Muhin Shu. It's a Japanese term. It comes from the tea tradition in Japan. You guys might be familiar with another pattern that comes from tea. There's a pattern called Shu Ha Ri that Alistair Cockburn made popular back in the day. He actually has it tattooed on his back. But Shu Ha Ri is a pattern that is intended to generate a learning hierarchy. It's intended to make certain that the grand masters at the top cannot be moved until they die. They are at the Ri level. As a beginner, you have to do exactly what you're told. That's the Shu level. And then you get certified. We trust you now. You can start teaching people, and maybe you can vary it a little bit. But if you look at where Shu Ha Ri has been adopted by martial arts, karate, for example, uses Shu Ha Ri. And there are karate experts who have been studying karate for 50 years and are still not at the Ri level. Because Ri, to do that, you kind of have to be a bit of a rebel. You have to get to a point where you go, I can't take it anymore. I've got to strike out and do something on my own. Maybe I could say that I'm at the Ri level, but I don't think so because I don't like the pattern at all. What I like is a learning ecosystem, where I define an ecosystem as a network of mutual benefit. Let's work together to get learning to happen. And that's the pattern that we use most of the time with the X-Scale stuff. We don't have any trainers. We don't have any master trainers. We're just coaches. And when we train these patterns, we have patterns for business agility, product management, and DevOps. They have some distinctive things about them, but the main thing is that they interlock to be able to generate whole organization capability. I'm not trying to sell you X-Scale. The point of Muhin Shu is that back when tea started in Japan, the tea tradition was completely different to what we have today. And I can prove it. If you think about Japanese tea, it is different to every other tea you can buy anywhere in the world. It's prepared differently. They serve it differently, but it's completely distinctive. It's very, at some stage, someone had to innovate Japanese tea, but you could not use the existing tea ceremony to invent the existing tea ceremony, because it's not about innovation at all. So Japanese tea came from a fellow named Senno Rikyu. I'm not going to go into detail about him either, because we're keeping things kind of light and bright. And his story is very sad. But what he achieved is fantastic. Rikyu invented what we're looking at. This is a Japanese tea house. And you see there's a very odd thing going on here. This is the front door. To get into the tea house, you have to step on this stone step and then bow very low to get in. Well, in Japanese society, back in the 15th century, during the Sengoku period. But even today, the depth of the bow tells you about the difference in rank. The deeper the bow, the more profound the distance, the social distance between the two people. The person who is lower has to bow more deeply to the person who's higher. Well, with this doorway, everybody who comes into the tea house has to bow all the way down to the ground. He was cutting across the idea of social distance, and you had to leave all of your marks of rank outside as well. Why was that important? It was important because Japan had suffered 200 years of terrible civil war. The Sengoku period was an appalling time in Japan, where not just like North and South or East and West, hundreds of different warlords, anarchy, chaos for 200 years. Rikyu's invention ended the Sengoku period. It ended civil war in less than 25 years. And all he did was change the way that tea was served so that information could flow sideways and up and down in a way that it had not been able to flow before. Learning could flow. They could resolve things by sharing their learnings. So the idea with Muhin Shu has to do with the way that we expect people to behave in agile teams. It's very common that we have someone, whether they have a title project manager or scrum master or product owner, that they tend to be the boss, and everybody does that, and what the boss wants, the boss gets. It's kind of baked into Scrum that the product owner has this privileged position where they get to call the priorities, even if everybody else thinks that they're full of nonsense. We're not going to do that if we use this pattern. The whole idea here is that you, even if you are a great product manager, you will be a DRI among DRIs. And if you're going to convince other people, you have to influence them. You can't use authority. So that means we get to interact and try to come up with decisions about acceptance criteria, priorities, and for that matter, features that we could deliver that are based on everybody's understanding of the mission and the shared constraints and the bottleneck, because there's always a bottleneck. That's the theory of constraints, the dominant constraint that we have to solve. So to use Steve Jobs' words about this idea, he said, in Apple, in his era, every team worked as a startup. The whole idea, the way they worked, was that the ideas, the best ideas, had to win, not the hierarchy. And that was fundamental to the approach we had to Agile back in XP days, when XP was the dominant flavor. So, interesting. I've got some strange marks on the screen. I'm not certain why. Oh, they're not stopping things. Okay, so that all sounds beautiful, but someone's got to make some decisions about who the DRIs are going to be. Who's directly responsible for which work items or agenda items if it's about a meeting? Because someone has to be, and someone has to be able to say, okay, we have until now, until the end of this meeting to make a decision. Or we have until the end of the week to make a decision. Whatever that time frame is, someone has to decide. So the idea is that we have one person who is acting like, if you think of a representative body, there's always someone who's a chairman or the speaker. They are in charge of protocol. And you could just call it a scrum master. That's okay. I'm not suggesting that you need to be changing your title. The neat thing about these ideas is they work no matter what titles and structures we're working with. And you don't have to use all of them. This is not a framework. You only use these ideas when you're experiencing the problems they solve. This is an idea we will look at a little bit later called you aren't going to need it. It's a very general idea. It applies to a lot of things in Agile. But here in particular, if we are trying to have one of these meetings where we want people to act using a balance of powers, we identify DRIs, well, then someone has to call that meeting and they have to set up an agenda and they have to either invite or assign DRIs. In Apple, they mainly invited people to be DRIs in meetings, which is an interesting idea in its own right, but maybe not so practical in a bank. Anyway, so they are effectively deciding who the deciders will be if the meeting cannot reach a unanimous consensus. So, in other words, everybody except for the DRI has a unanimous consensus. So the neat thing about this is that they are effectively a DRI themselves. They bring a particular kind of a decision or a responsibility to this meeting, and they say, okay, we have to come up with a plan about how we are going to execute this, how we're going to action it. And that's how they have made their decisions about who the DRIs are going to be. But in this meeting, they won't make the decisions. They will simply facilitate the decisions. They're still carrying the responsibility that they brought to the meeting. But if they're going to get people to take part in actioning it, then they have to get those people to self-organize. And this is a brilliant set of patterns to generate self-organization. Now, I am really concerned about my computer. I don't know if you guys can see. I see two weird lines on it I have not seen before. Oh, well, it's an old computer. It might be failing. So, reward outcomes, not outputs. Ooh, this sounds pretty scary. It is pretty scary. It's something that's very far from mainstream team level Agile. We love velocity. We love OKRs. Sometimes we are forced to use KPIs. There is a greasy pole of certification that often when trainers turn up in an organization, they'll start saying, oh, you have become very agile because we have issued many certificates. Certificates don't make people agile. They might fertilize the ground. And I guess I'm making a small pun by suggesting that certificates are like fertilizer. KPIs, they don't really generate outcomes either. And that might sound odd. If you've got a KPI, you've got a responsibility to fulfill, well, then you might go, well, if I fulfill my responsibility, then everything will work out. I just have to fulfill my KPI and the organization will be great. Unfortunately, KPIs tend to generate competitive behavior. If, for example, one team succeeds in fulfilling its KPIs, it's locked in its rewards, whether they are promotions or bonuses or pats on the head, doesn't really matter. They're going to be recognized and rewarded because they have shipped their product. Another team right next door might be struggling. And the first team has no incentive to help them. even if the division of labor is unfair, which it often is. They'll go, well, wow, man, I'm really sorry to hear that you have to work this weekend and all of the evenings of this week, and it sounds like all of the evenings of next week too. We've finished our bit. I'm going to go home and see my kids. Bye. If we think about this in terms of motivating people, motivating that kind of behavior isn't really what we want the reward model to be about. We want people to collaborate. So OKRs have become a popular way to motivate collaboration. And I'm not saying OKRs are bad, but there is a particular OKR, an objective being about the growth of the organization, the growth of its markets. If that's the basis of our reward, there is a kind of a metric called business throughput. Eli Goldratt, who invented the theory of constraints, you might have heard of him, and you might have heard of that. And if not, we can talk about it when we get to Q&A. Eli Goldratt had to invent throughput accounting because cost accounting was leading to stupid decisions. So to give you a really short story about it, basically, he mainly worked in manufacturing. He would go to a factory and he would look at the factory line and he would say to the management, look, you see that machine in the middle there? It's going ka-chunk, 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 ka-chunk. I'll call it the chunking machine. A lot of different inputs are going into it, but only a thin stream of output is coming out of it. That is your bottleneck. That is the dominant constraint in the way that you are manufacturing things. So that's your problem. And the management go, oh, wow, Mr. Goldratt, thank you. We never thought of that. That's wow, so clever. So what we're going to do is we're going to fire half the people who are producing the inputs to the chunking machine, because that will minimize operating expense and maximize utilization, which is what cost accounting tells us we want to do. And Goldratt would go, no, you buy another chunking machine. And the managers would say, but that's not going to minimize operating expense. So he had to invent a whole different kind of accounting theory called throughput accounting to be able to deal with this problem. And it produces a wonderful basis for making management decisions. We still have to do cost accounting to satisfy the regulators. This doesn't say don't do cost accounting, but it's a bigger and better picture and a much more simple and practical basis for making decisions. So if we use that one OKR for everybody, that we will be rewarded if the organization's business throughput, now I know what those lines are. Those are lines you guys are drawing in Zoom. Okay, that's all right. Now I understand what's going on. Someone's playing with the tools. Good. Don't scribble too much, but good. Okay, so anyway, if everybody has this same motivation, we are trying to grow our market, and we are trying, that includes getting more return out of it, and we're trying to take that return and plow it back in to grow our capability to generate return. Well, if that's the basis for our reward, then when you say, wow, I am really I don't know what I'm going to do. I've worked the last 3 weeks in a row and we have to get this thing out by next week to satisfy the client and we're in trouble. I will go, well, how can I help? Not bye-bye, I'm going to go see my kids. Because your reward is my reward. If we can get this thing to grow, if we can make a big return, then we will get more of a bonus or more of a promotion, or maybe just more of a nice afternoon meal, which also works for this kind of an idea. I've seen that work. I did some work for a bank, Commonwealth Bank of Australia, where we used the discretionary budget that the general manager had to reward people for what they were doing, because we weren't able to change their reward model. We'll talk about that when we get to the Q&A. Next pattern. You aren't gonna need it. This was really, look at where we are in time. We're doing good. Really fundamental. Really, really fundamental in XP. It was really where XP started. And if you're not familiar with XP, extreme programming, these days, not all Scrum Masters have heard of XP, but XP has something to offer every Scrum Master. And the reason is, I think every Scrum Master is aware of the book, Twice the Work in Half the Time. Well, when you first move to Scrum, you might see something like that. But there is an idea called the cost of change. And Scrum doesn't really work on trying to minimize the cost of change. Responding to change is one of the 4 manifesto values. You might wonder, well, wait a second. Maybe most people are actually pretty good at it. Maybe most organizations, doesn't matter. They manage to respond to change anyway. There's a survey, the largest and longest running survey in the Agile world, called the State of Agile Survey. And they have a question in this survey that asks, does Agile help your organization respond to changing market conditions? They've been asking this question for a while. 2018, only 4% of the respondents to the survey said that Agile helped their organization respond to changing market conditions. Maybe it got better. Last year, 2019, 6%. So only 94% said that Agile doesn't respond to change. Wow, how big a failure is that? A lot of the reason is the lack of attention to the cost of change. How can we attend to this? How can we minimize the cost of change? We can minimize the number of work items that we are tracking. We can minimize the number of lines of code that we have to maintain. We can minimize the specs. We can minimize everything that is going to involve work when we learn something. So you might go, well, okay, yeah, that sounds good in principle. In practice, how can we do that? As Scrum Masters, how can we do that? Well, here's two simple things we can do right off the bat. I'm not going to explain this complicated looking form. This is called a 3D Kanban. And if you want, in the Q&A, we can talk about that a bit as well. But the basic idea is to apply YAGMI to a Kanban. Now, in a Kanban, we minimize work in progress. We want to pull the work. We don't want to push the work into progress. We want to pull it into done. That's a way of observing you aren't going to need it as well. But the fundamental of you aren't going to need it. You either need it right now, that's when you do it. It's like just in time. You don't do it because you're going to need it later. So why would we break stories out of a bunch of features to make a backlog of stories if we're not ready to deliver those features yet? We have our analysts do a lot of work, and then when we finally get the stories to a place where we're ready for them to go into a sprint, we're ready to go and deliver those stories, now they're going to require a whole bunch of change. That's work. What if we just said, you know, the fact is, we're not going to get any benefit from delivering stories from 2 different features in the one team. And the reason we won't get benefit is it'll make both those features take twice as long to deliver. Now, I'm using this word feature. All I really mean is something that has actual marketable business value. We always say that stories all have to be valuable, and they do have to be valuable. It doesn't mean I can release a story by itself. Often we talk about a product increment as something that rolls off the end of the line. It's a bunch of stories all together. There are other ways of doing release planning. XP didn't use product increments. It was much more like Kanban in terms of its release strategy, but it was still coherent. The point is, if I have a backlog full of stories from multiple features like this, then it's going to take longer to deliver each of those features than if I do this. If this is the most valuable feature, I want to deliver that one first, get it to market. Continuous delivery, continuous deployment. Let's get that out so that we can get some benefit from it, some business value from it. And then we'll do this feature. If I have 2 teams, maybe I can do them in parallel, one for each team. But that means I could then say that one way to observe the agony, you aren't going to need it, is to say, oh, let's not break the work down into stories until I've got a team that's ready to take this feature and deliver it. Well, if a features are atoms of release planning, then once I've got a team available for this feature, I've got a bunch of acceptance criteria for this feature, I hand that to them, then they can do the breakout into stories. That's not very much work because it's only one feature. And because there was one team, they can do that by themselves. We don't need to have big meetings to do that. There are ways of breaking the work down breadth first this way that dramatically reduce the amount of analytic work we have to do and dramatically reduce the cost of change. So the same thing would apply to breaking features out of an epic. We don't want to have features that we're trying to understand unless they're important for our next release goal. It's a longer conversation. For now, I think you get the idea. The same idea applies to quality problems, defects. We shouldn't let them live very long. We should really fix them all immediately because they increase the cost of change and, for that matter, the cost of quality, but that's a different conversation. Okay, so next one. I don't know whether 1960s Batman and Robin never made it to Russia. When I was a kid, I used to watch this on television. I was a child of the 60s. And Batman and Robin would basically have a rope and they would walk up the wall to get to fight the bad guys. And it was a very camp show, a very, very ironic show. So they would always walk by some popular celebrity of the day and he would wish them well. And of course, they were actually on a flat surface and he was just sitting in a pit because they weren't really walking up a building. But this idea of walking the wall is something that a lot of Scrum Masters don't think about because it's kind of something from Kanban. And we kind of talked about it already a little bit. If we think about the daily Scrum, or where I come from, we call it a stand-up. Well, how do we do this thing? According to the Scrum Guide, we ask 3 questions. We ask, what did you do yesterday? What are you planning to do today? And are there any showstoppers? We basically go around the circle and then we're kind of done. I hate this. It's bureaucratic, it's patronizing, it's very project manager-like. It's like we're checking things off a checklist. It's like we're the parent, they're the children. That sucks. Walking the wall is a much simpler idea. All we do is we look at the card wall or the Kanban and we'll say, okay, here is the done column. Which of our work items are closest to done? We want to pull the work. We want to minimize work in progress. So, okay, this one's very close. Who's going to work on this one today? Maybe 1 or 2 people put their hands up. We want to work on that today. We were working on it yesterday. Fantastic. If you get stuck, then let us know and we'll try and help. But if you're happy, you want to pull, it's great. So is that going to keep you busy all day? We often don't even have to ask. They'll figure out, well, I'm going to work on this in the morning. In the afternoon, I'm free to help with something else. So then we can say, well, let's look at the column before we get to things that are about to get done. Now, Scrum tends to use just 3 columns. Kanban, you can make as many columns as you like. I like that idea of having as many columns because there's a lot of different workflow states I'd like to understand. And we can then use a cumulative flow diagram and that sort of thing. But the point is, if we simply look at who's going to work on moving these cards that are closest to done, well, then everybody will have an idea about when they're full, when their ideas for the day are full up. And when it comes to something that's stuck, and someone can say, well, I was trying to move this yesterday, but we've got this problem. I can't get access to this environment, whatever it is. They'll do that by themselves. You don't have to ask them 3 questions. They'll tell you they're stuck and everybody else will pile on. And all you really need to do, you can actually be completely silent and just point at the column and let them have their conversations. That works really, really quickly. And that way no one says, oh, you know, this bloody stand up for 20 minutes every morning. It just takes care of itself, and you can do it in a way where you can actually circulate the facilitation role as well. So walking the wall is a much quicker way to do the daily scrum, much more fun, much more engaging, and much simpler. Okay, this one is a bit more complicated. So those of you who don't have much of a technical background, hold on tight. So rebasing and refactoring. Refactoring, merciless refactoring, was fundamental to XP back in the day. In fact, a lot of the stuff that we think of these days as continuous integration, continuous delivery, continuous deployment, those weren't words in XP days because that was what we were doing anyway. We didn't need words for those things. So the idea was, and don't worry about the diagram quite yet, the idea was that when we have to deliver a solution to a work item, the first thing we do is we build a test, an automated test for the work item. This is kind of fundamental to CI/CD these days. But an awful lot of scrums don't do it. They do the test after. If you do the test after, well, it's an afterthought. And the test doesn't actually help you then, because what you really want from the test is to know whether you have a solution or not. If you're going to write a test anyway, why not write it up front? And it'll focus everybody on, well, is this actually the problem we're trying to solve? Is this the problem the story is talking about? So test first, that's kind of, say again? Oh, okay, I'll keep going. Test first is kind of fundamental to DevOps. But refactor mercilessly, that's critical too. The idea with refactoring is, I've written a test, I've written a solution. The solution is the simplest thing that could possibly work. Very simple solution. Often it involves some cut and paste from other things that I've already built. So I've got something that's messy. I've got something with duplication of code. I've got something with dependencies that go around in a circle or long. I would like to improve the design of the code. That's called refactoring. Martin Fowler defined refactoring. He wrote the first book on it as improving the design of existing code. Now, refactoring doesn't need to be about code. It can also be about organizations. It can be about business streams. It can be about marketing plans. It can be about lawsuits. All of these things have some technical debt baked in, either by us as we're developing them or by the rest of the organization. If we are mercilessly refactoring, paying off the technical debt, which is to say, reducing the cost of quality, we make our lives enormously easier, because cost of quality goes super exponential with the number of defects. We can talk about that in the Q&A as well. So point is, refactoring is how we make certain we can keep getting twice the work in half the time. If we don't do it, technical debt mounts up and up and up and up until we're getting half the work in twice the time. And shortly after that, one of two things will happen. Either someone will cancel your project and blame it on you because you're the Scrum Master. It wasn't the product owner's fault. They were just prioritizing things. Or someone will say, well, most of this code now, we have to freeze it. It's legacy. We'll put a microservices layer on top of it. It will never be changed again. We wind up with code bases that look like the city of Troy, one Troy on top of another, on top of another. There were dozens of Troys in the historical record because it kept on getting invaded and knocked down. The cost of change became too high. So that's one thing. The second thing, and the reason for this diagram, is we need a workflow, a modern workflow that lets us do this. To be able to do this refactoring thing, we have to be able to share ownership of code. And most people who are working technically these days use a tool called Git to do that. It was a tool that was invented by Linus Torvalds, who was the guy who started Linux. So Git provides us with a really easy, simple workflow for doing exactly this. But most delivery teams, most developers either don't know it or don't have a reason to stick to it because they are not refactoring, not mercilessly refactoring. And there's a reason why they're not. And it's because they're put under a lot of time pressure by the manager. The manager says, I don't want you to pay off a technical debt. I want you to meet the deadline, ship the feature, get it out there. I don't care if it's messy. That's not a big deal now. Worry about that later. So most of this technical debt isn't actually coming from the developers. So that means this advice to rebase is a way, it's a rigorous workflow for doing this. Basically what you do, it's called out in the second paragraph. If you're technically minded, then you know what I mean when I talk about rebase. So I won't go into detail about that now. But if we are putting our teams under silly time pressure, they are going to have to cut corners, and technical debt will mound up, even if they are trying to refactor. It'll be coming from everybody else, all the other teams that are cutting corners. So this is a problem where this is only part of the solution. This pattern is a pattern we can do at a team level, but we need an organizational solution here as well. And that's something we deal with in the business agility end of Xscale, but we're not going to worry about that now. Okay, next. Oh, this one seems like it's just obvious. Smaller teams, tighter loops, surely. Small batch sizes, that's what we ought to be doing. I don't know what size your teams are, but I can tell you that there is an ideal size for a self-organizing team because there's quite a lot of data available on this. And there's a gentleman named Dunbar, Robin Dunbar. He's professor of evolutionary psychology at, can you hold on a minute? I'm in the middle of something, darling. Could you do a bit less banging, please? I hope I don't get into trouble. Anyway, so Dunbar studied not just the ideal size for a team, a self-organizing team, but the ideal size for a self-managing stream, the ideal size for a self-directing portfolio. The numbers are very small. So a team of 5 or 6 is ideal for a self-organizing team. More than that, and you tend to get one person in the middle, whether they're called a scrum master or a project manager or just the best connected person or the most authoritative person or whatever, they start acting as a traffic cop and you get more indirect conversations. So if we can avoid going to 7 and above, then we have a much easier time of things. And I include the scrum master in that number. So that means maybe it's a scrum master in a team of 5, or maybe scrum master is a role that can be shared among the members of a self-organizing team, because it's really just simple facilitation. It's not that difficult for someone to learn. And you don't have to have a certificate to do it. Come back to that idea. What we want to do is tighten the loops, because that way we are able to course correct, to make adjustments as we go along. And these little adjustments are critical for adapting to change, whether it's internal change or change in the market. Look at where we are. We're doing good. So I think we're doing good. Yeah, we should be doing good. So point is this: adapting to change, embracing change. That's what Agile is about. Now, it's only one of the 4 values, but it's the one that actually affects the business. If we can adapt to change in such a way that we can maintain the business, defend it against things like, well, the current nonsense that's going on with the virus, that's got an impact, a massive impact. If we can adapt to that change, then we can survive where our competition won't. Now, you might go, wait a second. Sberbank is a giant bank, 300,000 people. We don't have any forces like you are describing. We are safe. Everybody else might have troubles. We will be the very last corporation in the world to to fail. Yeah, Kodak said that. In the 1920s and 30s, there were a lot of banks that said that. Big ones too. Right now, we are looking at massive change. We have the challenge of our lives is on our plates right now. So anything that helps us adapt to that is going to be really, really good for us, really good for our teams, really good for our business streams, really good for the bank. It might not feel too threatened yet, but you get a little bit of gray hair, you start to realize that things can surprise you. So what's the idea of tight loops? Well, or tighter loops. Scrum says you can have a 1-week sprint. That sounds good. Maybe that sounds too ambitious to you. I would suggest that if that sounds too ambitious, that you are kind of thinking about the old Scrum, because the old Scrum used to say that you have to commit to delivering this much stuff by the end of the sprint. If you don't deliver that, then someone is going to yell at you. These days, Scrum says, well, that's a forecast. We're trying to work at a sustainable pace. That's one of the agile principles. So if we're going to work at a sustainable pace, we want to be able to make adjustments, take learning into account. And that's where something like a 1-week sprint is very powerful, much more powerful than a 2-week one. And you're like, but yeah, but at the end of 1 week, we won't have finished a product increment. Yeah, you won't. That's okay. No harm done. You can still have a retro. You can still make certain there's a review of the work that has been done. You can still take that learning into account. And taking it into account makes it much easier for you to get product market impact and much easier for you to get a win without people yelling at you because they didn't get what they wanted. So you could take this further. I like the idea of cycles that work in like a 2-hour increment. You might think, wait a second, that's really, we're in the land of DevOps now, not Scrum. That's okay. We can still try it and we can find out what it's good for, what it's not good for. In a hackathon kind of a format when you're doing a lot of experimentation, and just by the way, tight loops mean you can do a lot of experimentation and you need to, and there's a way to defend it, and we can talk about that too if you want. The lovely thing about this stuff is that it's a bit like driving a car. When you drive a car, you don't just point it in the right direction and let it go. It's constant small adjustments. That's agile. So finally, Dunbar quality circles. Dunbar is a very interesting fellow. He has a lot of results that say that the right sizes for teams and streams and portfolios and the larger groupings above those, whatever you call them, and you might be calling these things tribes. You might even have heard of the Dunbar number. A lot of people think the Dunbar number is 150. That's supposed to be the maximum size for a tribe. I asked Dunbar about this when I interviewed him. You can find my interview with him on YouTube. And he said, no. That's the right size, or the maximum size, for an isolated subsistence level village that has no interaction with the outside world at all. In modern organizations where we have many overlapping networks of trust, he said the number is more like 50 to 60. And in between the 5 or 6 and 50 or 60, you've got the number that's 15 to 20. Basically, his numbers go up. They're a series. It's not just a single number. They go up by multiples of 3. So what we're seeing here in this picture is people from 3 teams meeting in a set of quality circles. Now, if we have such tiny teams, the ones I was just talking about, we have to keep them aligned to their purpose, and we have to keep them aligned to each other. So the idea with quality circles is an idea that goes back to the 1960s. Very, very simple, very powerful idea. What we do is, let's say that we have one quality circle for the analysts, another one for the designers, another one for the front-end developers, another one for the back-end developers, if we've got cross-functional teams. If it's component teams, it's different. So what we want is for 3 teams for the developers to meet across the teams, separately to the analysts meeting across the teams, designers, and so on. So if we stripe the teams with these specialties, which they probably already are, we can get them to share learning. And this group of 3 people, there's another group of 3 people, another. We gave each of them a little Kanban to work with. Problems, learnings, proposals for new ways of working or improved ways of working, and proposals for new features we could deliver that would actually help hit the market. These little circles come up with ideas for how to improve not just their own team, but the way the teams are supporting each other. 3 teams, 3 little teams, that's a very easy thing to do. We can run these quality circles before we have the team retros. And that way, each retro is fully informed about what's going on with the other 2 teams, their needs, their concerns, their learnings, their ideas, their opportunities, ways they can help us, ways we can help them. Our retros then can dramatically improve not just our own team, but the situation of the other teams. And we could then say, well, 3s of 3s of 3s, there are ways to have these quality circles cut across the streams, cut across the portfolios. It's a model we call Camelot. It's probably too complicated to talk about now. So, where are we in time? I think we're bang on the hour, and that's sort of where I wanted to get us to. I hope I have given you a flavor of some patterns that are not mainstream Scrum, but are useful to solving problems that you might have. Maybe you don't have those problems. That's okay. Then don't use those patterns. So I think maybe we open the floor for some questions and answers.
So Peter, we have currently we have one question on Slido. So it's when I get the newsletter, the architect of team A has promoted to PO of team A, product owner of team A. I think yes. If product owner is a role of authority or agile is misunderstood here.
That's a good question. It's difficult to be an architect in an agile culture that hasn't thought about the role of architects. I have seen architects put in individual teams, and that doesn't work very well because then their view is covering multiple teams, and they wind up having to support their team as a designer or as a lead developer at the same time as worrying about multiple teams. They're multitasking, and it's very hard. There's another way we can do it. We could make them a technical product owner. That's often done. But the trouble there is that actually we want the teams to be the customers for the architect, not the other way around. So if the teams need support from the architect, we want them to say, hey, Mr. Architect or Miss Architect, we need some help. We have these problems. Same problem across all these teams. We need a common solution. Please apply yourself to this. We'd like to prioritize a backlog for you, not the other way around. How can we do that? Well, one thing we can do, I talked about those quality circles. What if we said that each quality circle will pick one person, it can be a different person every time, we'll rotate it, but one person who is going to go and meet with the architect. So that way, the architect has a nice coherent meeting with one member of each of those quality circles, and those quality circles already agreed on what their common concerns and needs are. Well, then that's a pretty easy meeting to do, nice and quick, just a bit of prioritization, and the architect will then take care of our concerns and serve us. It becomes a servant leader. That's really what we would like. But we can take that further. We could do the same thing with the product owner, with the coach, with a project manager. What we'd like to do is have regular face-to-face time with them without them parachuting into our team and giving us a bunch of orders and parachuting out again. So I'm not saying that it is easy to make that change, but it is certainly possible. And one of the things that we're talking about in the coaching community is how we can start to look at where we have learning bottlenecks, like an architect as a product owner instead of as a servant leader.
Okay, so we have another question. Where do the figures for 150 people in tribe sorry, in 150 people in tribe come from? Most likely, this should be highly product specific.
I have to agree with you entirely. So where does 150 come from? Let's think of it in terms of social events. If you wanted to have some people babysit your child, let's say that you're going to go and, I don't know, take care of a sick relative, and you need someone to take care of your child. There are not many people in the world you would trust to do that. There's maybe 5 or 6 people that you would really trust to take care of your child. If someone said 150 people, you would say, no, I don't trust 150 people to take care of my child. There's a lot of social grooming, a lot of communication, and a lot of shared empathy and experience that's required before you would trust someone that deeply. Well then, okay, how about the next level up? Because 5 or 6, yes, that's the sort of deep family friendship stuff that we all understand. The next level up, 3 times that number, that's a sporting team, a football team, a cricket team, a baseball team. I don't know what sports are popular in Russia, but anyway, maybe hockey. That's a typical size for, if you include both the defense and the offense, it's usually around about 15 to 20. Okay, that's still not 150. If I was to try and get 150 people to play hockey together, I don't think so. That's not a very good hockey game, because we can't coordinate. The amount of social grooming required to be strategic in the way you play on the ice, that's not going to work. Okay, but for a sports team, that's pretty good. How about in Australia, we like to have barbecues. We get together and we have an outdoor grill, and we grill some meat. It's a very sunny place. So it's a very outdoor oriented place. So a barbecue, well, 50, 60 people could have a very nice barbecue together, or maybe a dinner party. That's a good number for a party, 50 or 60. You get a really, really fun party with that number. You try to have 150 people at a barbecue or a dinner party? No, that's not going to work very well. You might wind up with, your very conservative friends and your hippie friends. They wind up yelling at each other. Someone's going to get drunk. You can have a bad outcome with that sort of a number. So 150. Well, I'll tell you where it actually comes from. It's about the right number for a wedding. If you were going to have a wedding, 150 is pretty good. Where it comes from is there was some videos that Henrik Nieberg produced in 2012 to 14 about the Spotify model, which these days is a dirty word for a lot of people. It has not worked out very well for a lot of people. And I think you guys have had some exposure to it. I'm really curious about how well it's worked for you. But anyway, maybe via ing, because it also, in Spotify, they don't use the Spotify model. What they do is very similar to SAFe these days, very command and control. I don't like it very much. But that's because they're trying to worry about scaling. With Xscaler, we don't worry about scaling, we worry about descaling. We worry about these numbers. So Nieberg made his videos, and he said that the Dunbar number is 150. That's the maximum size you can have before politics destroys the group. So he said, you should try to stick to 100, no more than 100. 150 is too big. Well, then Dean Leffingwell looked at what Nieberg had said and said, the Dunbar number is 150. That's the maximum size train you can have in SAFe, is 150. Or maybe it's more, doesn't matter. It's way too big. 50, 60 is really the maximum for that kind of business organization. Now you might go, wait a second. We have an organization of 300,000 people. How do we coordinate that with groups of 50, 60? There are some organizations, like, for example, Hire in China. Hire was a very large organization, very bureaucratic, very top-down. They refactored themselves into micro enterprises of 50, 60, thereabouts, a little more sometimes, very successfully. They produce most of the world's white goods, which is to say washers and dryers and air conditioners and things like that. They own the General Electric brand, amongst others. So maybe that would be a good thing to do, but that's not the kind of decision that we get to decide in our scrums. So coming back to the 150, the number is bullshit most of the time, if you pardon my French. It's a number that has caused a huge amount of suffering in the agile world for no good reason except that some of the people at the level said it out loud and a bunch of people took them seriously. It's one of the things that we're trying to fix with Xscale, because what we're focused on is descaling, which is to say refactoring into little autonomous groups that are the right size for their function.
So, next question then. You mentioned that the role of the Scrum Master can be divided between the team members. Does that mean that there is no need for a separate Scrum Master in the team?
That's a good question. I would like to think of it starting with a really small number. If there's one person, just one person in a team, do they need a Scrum Master? Nah, that'd be silly. If there's two people in a team, do they need a Scrum Master, a separate Scrum Master? Nah, that'd be silly. 3, silly. 4, silly. 5, maybe. Certainly the Scrum Guide says 5. 6, maybe. 7, definitely. So somewhere between 5 and 7, we need a separate role. So in my experience, 6 is a beautiful number for 2 reasons. It's 3 pairs. Pairs are very good at taking work items and doing things. And there's also 2 triples. Triples are very good, as we were looking at with quality circles, at sharing learning. So it's kind of a sweet spot for the division between learning things and doing things. To give you an idea about the triples, because pairing has been in Agile for a long time. If you go to a dinner party and you're talking with one person one-on-one, and a third person walks up, they will listen to the conversation. Usually the conversation is one person explaining something to another person. And they will think strategically about where is this conversation going next. And they will lead in a different direction. And then one person might follow them. The third person will go, I'm going to build on that. So you get conversations that tend to be more dynamic. There's more sharing with a triple. And a fourth person walks up, usually splits into 2 pairs. So getting back to the question, how easy a job do we have of breaking the work down so that these pairs can then run with it autonomously for some period of time before they come back together and do their daily scrum? Could they, a team of 6, could they take turns being the scrum master for the rest? I can't see why not. But here's where we have an organizational problem. Often a scrum master just means a very junior project manager. They're responsible for the project manager. They go, yes, sir, or yes, ma'am. And they're sort of, they're on a career path. They're going to become a manager. They're going to be highly paid one day. It's a viable career path. Likewise, maybe they want to go on a different career path. They want to become a coach and then a trainer. And one day they have a lot of gray hair and they sit there saying, you don't need scrum masters. No. If you're in an organization where those are the career paths, you have to make your choices, then maybe this is an organizational role. But the beautiful thing about this descaling idea, things like quality circles, it gives us some alternatives. It gives us ways to get alignment between self-organizing, purely self-organizing teams without delegating to Scrum Master and Product Owner. That's a longer conversation. And I'm not saying that you want to do that in Sberbank. So I'm not trying to challenge anything you guys are doing. It's more a matter of there are some ways to make life easier. And maybe that idea of saying, well, we'll share the Scrum Master role might be a way to make it easier, even if one of you is going to have to go and spend some face time with the project manager, maybe you could take turns doing that too. I'm not saying it's the right thing to do, but I've seen it work very nicely.
So, in order to convince the team that DRI sometimes needs them to get education in some field, otherwise he just uses his weight as an expert. How to avoid that?
Good question. So this is where the balance of powers pattern works wonderfully. Because what you say is, okay, you are the DRI for either this, this kind of work, or this kind of knowledge, or this work item, or this agenda item for a meeting. What that means is that if the rest of the team is not unanimous, then you get to make a decision. If the rest of the team is unanimous, then you don't get to make a decision, even if you don't like what they decided. So now you have to influence them. How can you influence them if you don't have credible knowledge, if you're ignorant of the responsibility you're supposed to be carrying out for them as someone providing leadership as a service? So that phrase, leadership as a service, that's the patterns, the first 4 patterns we talked about. If we give people the idea that they're supposed to be servant leaders, that's not very effective. They go, oh yes, I am a servant leader. Now do it my way. If we give people the idea that we have a little protocol we call leadership as a service, that's how we run our meetings. And we want you to provide us with leadership as a service. Let's say you are an architect. We need your leadership in architecture. But if we have better ideas, we are more experienced, in fact, you're in this role because a friend of yours put you in there, we're not obliged to do what you say. If we are unanimous, we can overrule you. That balance of powers is wonderful because it's so simple. And it means that then people are inspired to make trade-offs so that they can get unanimous. And as a DRI, you have a real reason to be credible, to be influential. You want to make certain the team makes ideas that are going to work because you are going to have to carry the responsibility of carrying out their decision. That's an important responsibility, and you want to make certain they make a good decision. So the lovely thing then is we kind of have a nice balance that encourages everybody to establish trust, everybody to play fair, everybody to bring their best thinking. And that's why we use it.
Okay. So Peter, how do you prefer to run stand-up meeting if there are only 2 options? Option A, 3 classical questions about yesterday, today blockers, and B, focus on sprint goals.
So we talked about walking the wall before, and that's basically how I would like to run a daily sprint, daily scrum. A stand-up is what I would ordinarily call it because I come from XP. So the neat thing about this is we can say, okay, given what's on the board, let's worry about how we're going to get things done. But there's a higher level of that. And I'm going to go back a couple of slides to talk about it. Because when you're asking about outcomes, this is about outcomes. I might actually, if I go here and that's the one I want. Oh, I've got to go down the bottom and change it so it's doing this, I think. Yes, that's what I want. And then I want to zoom in like so. There we go. And I want to close that because I can't see anything. Here we go. Okay. So here's the idea. I have some products that are actually in production. These things have been deployed, and I'm doing various kinds of data science to understand the analytics that are coming out of this stuff. And I've got a feedback loop that's informing my product canvas, or in Xscale, we have a thing we call a pirate canvas that uses the pirate metrics. I'm not going to talk about it now. So basically, this feedback loop, we want that to be rapid. So we have some people who are carrying responsibility for this. In some of our teams, data scientists, data analysts, they really embody this stuff. But we can think about this as part of a board we could walk every day if they're embedded in a team. Here I've got systems integration testing environment. This is actually production if we're doing continuous deployment. These green things are features. I'm pulling them into this environment. And I have a feedback loop that influences the way that we analyze what features we need to deliver next. Because usually, if we're focused on outcomes, we are worried about what is the bottleneck in the growth of our market. So we can do a bunch of what-if stuff, A/B testing, in our systems integration testing in our production environment to be able to test hypotheses about whether we have actually opened a bottleneck or not. So there's a feedback loop there. Feature integration testing can inform the estimates that we make. Did we really complete this feature or not? Maybe our estimates weren't very good. So there's a feedback loop there. And then here I have two teams. Each is one row. You'll see this is a team that has one feature, and this is a team that has another feature. They just pick the highest priority feature off of the stack of features. And the first thing they do, it's called design, it's really breaking the feature down into stories and test scenarios. The first thing they'll do is they'll implement usually a BDD test. If you're not familiar with BDD, we should talk about that another time. But the whole idea with this is we want to then start to figure out what stories, what tests for stories do we need to have, and then we'll build solutions for those. Then we'll do the integration here, and there's a missing column, we should say refactoring here as well. So that work of pulling at that level, we can do that in our daily Scrum. Should we do this work in the same Scrum? Maybe not, depends on the structure of our stream. Maybe that's a different team doing that. And this work, again, it might be a different team. So the question then is, if we want to minimize the number of cards on the wall so that we can have the quickest little meetings, we can adjust things based on learnings, then maybe we need a little bit more than a daily Scrum and a weekly retro. Maybe we need to be able to do what they did in Toyota, with the Toyota production system they apply to all their manufacturing lines. If we see something that's not well done, we need to be able to pull a cord and say, hey, we need to send a message to the next level up, there's a problem to solve. And what we're going to do is the simplest things we can do while we're waiting for that problem to be solved. This is all stuff that can be raised at a daily Scrum. It's not about the 3 questions. It's about getting the work to done, whatever done is, whether done is in data science or done is in system integration testing or feature integration testing or continuous integration, whatever we define done as, we are trying to get the work there as quickly as possible, which is to say we want to minimize the work in progress. This is work in progress because we're implementing it. This is work in progress because we're analyzing it. We don't want to analyze things we don't have to. I hope I'm answering the question.
So is it possible to teach people how to behave responsible and develop direct response to DRI? And what kind of motivation do we need to encourage people to act as DRIs? How to develop this in the team?
That's a really good question. So I'll go back to that slide actually. So that little protocol I talked about, the balance of powers, actually if I go, let's do it like this. Let's look at the elements again because it is quite powerful and very simple. So the basic elements are, from meeting to meeting, we need to have an agenda. When Jobs defined his DRIs for his inner circle, each of these guys, when they went to talk with their teams, he was the speaker for their meeting when he was meeting with them. When they go to their teams, they are the speaker. So they have to identify the DRIs. How do we know these DRIs are going to play fair? If I give someone responsibility to deliver something, and they don't do it, what consequences are there? If we are meeting in a meeting and they start trying to dominate the meeting, as a speaker, I can do something about that. But when they're not in the meeting, maybe they're still dominating people. They're not behaving in an agile way. This comes down to a reward model. If someone sees that they will get a reward for being disruptive or for playing politics, they will be disruptive. They will play politics. If they see that their reward is based on us getting as much market impact for the work we ship as possible, then they will try and win that game. That doesn't mean that they will play nice, but they will work collaboratively with us, because we are also trying to get the most product market impact, the most business throughput. So it comes down to, if they are rewarded in a way that doesn't encourage agile behaviors, collaborative behaviors, there's very little we can do to make them fly right. If, on the other hand, we can say, okay, we can identify these problems and we need to get the coaches involved, and we're going to tell the coaches we think the reward models are wrong, the coaches can take that kind of learning to HR and say, hey, can we change the way these reward models work, because they're not set up to generate the kinds of behaviors that are going to be a win. Maybe HR doesn't have that power. But HR, if enough of us are doing that, can say to the CFO's office or the COO's office or whoever it is, hey, we know you really wanted this agile capability, but right now it's hamstrung because of our reward models. Can we change them a little bit, even just experimentally, just for one stream, just to see if it will work, if it will actually change the behavior? That's how we usually get those sorts of changes. And I know it's not a very good answer, because you're looking for an answer for a specific person in a specific team. But if one person is behaving this way, usually a lot of them are. And there's some game theoretic stuff that goes with that. Oh, actually, I'll give you a website to look at in answer to that question as well. So if I go and, let's see, I'll go over here just a moment. I really want to go to a simple browser. If I go to Google and I Google, yeah, I don't care. I Google evolution, that's not good, evolution of trust. There are some game theoretics that go with this. It's this site here, ncase.me/trust. So if I click on that, I'm not going to show it to you now. You can look at this offline. There is a lot here about how good behavior and bad behavior wind up becoming dominant in a culture and what we can do about it. So highly, highly recommend this site. It's really great fun too.
So Peter, I guess it will be our last question. So if we have 20 people in our team, like development, testing, maintenance, etc., would you advise us to split into 3 smaller teams and hold mini dailies and arrange a big one once a week?
Yes, in fact, what I would do is I would split into 3 and use quality circles to make certain that people stay in touch. 3 cross-functional teams, and give each of those teams a related but different feature, a different outcome to generate. Usually what I would think is, I want to have one epic for the group of 20. That epic ought to have a normal form, like why we are trying to deliver anything. There has to be a business reason why. Whose behavior we are trying to affect, how we're trying to affect it, and what we think we're trying to do to cause that change in behavior for that business reason. If we can get that much of a mission statement, then we can start to think, well, what's the most important release goals for that epic? Then for those release goals, what would be a feature that will actually be something we can release, the smallest releasable chunk of functionality? Then we can say, okay, we'll give that to one of our 3 teams. They'll do that one. What's the next feature? What's the next feature? And then those teams can independently split them out into stories. We don't need a common backlog. They can each have their own little backlog. Working that way means that some of those teams will have an easy time. They'll power ahead. Other ones will get a bit stuck. But having those quality circles once a week before retros means that each team can adapt to the needs of the other. And if they have a common reward that they're working towards, then they're all motivated to help each other achieve it. That's usually enough for 2 or 3 teams like that. If it's more, then we have to talk about councils, but that's a different conversation.
Okay, thank you so much for answering all of the questions. Peter, do you mind if I run the poll like usual?
I don't mind at all. I'd be very happy. I should also say, if anyone wants any other questions answered, I'm happy to stick around longer. It's up to you guys.
Коллеги, запустили опрос. Будем признательны за обратную связь. Прям в Zoom. Let me check. Still going.
Oh, I'm very flattered, I think. If I understand what 5s are.
So people, colleagues are asking us to make these conferences more often.
Sounds like a good idea. We should get the coaches involved too.
Спасибо большое, коллеги, за вашу обратную связь.
А будет где-нибудь запись этого выступления выложена у нас на ресурсе?
Да, коллеги. Мы поделимся в дайджесте и в гильдии скрамов.
Спасибо.
Okay, so I think we have time for a bit of an encore, as long as you're okay with it, Vika. What do you think?
Yeah. I still have time.
We go for another, yeah, we go for another quarter of an hour, 20 minutes, and as long as that way, we want people to get their questions answered. And what we've talked about here are some pretty advanced subjects. So I expect that there will be questions.
Okay,
if you allow me, can I start?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, please do.
Okay, in a situation like we are experiencing right now, huge changes and decisions have to be made at the top and then de-escalated quickly down the whole system. How do you do it in an agile way?
That's a really good question. So most of team level agile focuses on little stepwise improvements in market impact, little stories we can do. It doesn't really focus on breadth first, focuses on hill climbing. It's as if we want to climb Mount Everest, well, whatever is the tallest mountain in the Himalayas. And the way we're going to do it is we will walk up the very first hill, and when we get to the top, that must be the biggest one, surely. We need something breadth first instead of depth first to be able to approach these questions. In Xscale, we have some techniques for doing this. I mentioned Pirate Canvas, and there's a nice post we have up that sort of gives the basics for that. We actually need to do a follow-up because we've made it more sophisticated since. But the idea is we want to be able to understand the bottlenecks that our market is experiencing, not just our organization. I talked about the chunking machine before, and that's really about how we are delivering value to market, but it's not a one-way flow. A bank is a platform for many different market segments to all get mutual benefit. Borrowers, lenders, and corporations of various sorts. They all wind up using the bank services as channels to deliver those benefits. Which of these channels are currently clogged up? Which of them are failing? Which of them are growing? The bank needs to be able to pivot, to be able to both address the things that are growing and to be able to look at unclogging, opening up the bottlenecks in the ones that are not growing, because an awful lot of people will suffer if we don't. So it comes down to, how do we make those decisions in such a way that it will grow the bank, that it'll be good for the bank as well. Since the bank is a set of channels for an ecosystem, it's all about mutual benefit between the different customer groups, different market segments. Thinking about it that way as an ecosystem allows us to talk in terms of the pirate metrics, which is to say, acquisition, activation, retention, referral, and return. The acronym is R, which is why it's called the pirate metrics. So if we look at these as fundamental to the way an ecosystem grows, we have to acquire people into a market ecosystem. That doesn't mean that they're actually going to be our customers. It just means they start to interact with us, we give them some benefit. Maybe we report on the stock prices of today. That's a way to activate them if we have better numbers than other people. Activating them, they have to identify themselves well enough that we could, in principle, get some benefit from their behavior. So if we could get people to sign up for accounts, even if they don't have any money to put in the accounts, well, then we can start to look at, well, maybe they don't have any money put in the account. Maybe they could be customers for some sort of debt product. When it comes to retaining them, well, we have forceful ways of retaining people. But what we would really like is stuff where they keep coming back to us because they keep getting more benefit from us than from other banks. Referral, we want them to introduce other people, not necessarily the same kind of people. And then return, we have to make money out of all of that. So looking at the pirate metrics gives us a way to think breadth first about where the market's at, and we can then understand which analytics that we have, that we've instrumented, this is how we sense the change in the market, which of those are relevant to which of those pirate metrics, and then we can start to say, all right, now, what kinds of goals do we have for each of these metrics, and which of these goals are more or less important? Sometimes they'll be about bottlenecks. Sometimes they'll be about hypotheses, assumptions we're making that we have to test. So the neat thing with this kind of broad approach is that we can build out a landscape of epics. We can give them a normal form, why, who, how, what, but we can build it out, and then we can start to play some simple numbers games to figure out which of these are our priorities. Until we've done that kind of breadth first work, what we usually do with Scrum or Kanban or XP, any of the team level stuff, won't really come into play. We do this to be able to hand an epic to a business stream and say, hey, we want you guys to maximize the growth in that epic, or to validate the assumptions, whatever the release goal is. Doing that breadth first is something that isn't normally part of Agile, but I see it as essential to business agility. I hope I answered.
So we have a question from Natalia Kovtsur, right?
Yes, Kovtsur.
Kovtsur.
Hello, is it okay? Is it okay to have two Scrum Masters in one team?
Good question. Wow, how big is the team?
We have a distributed team. It's 8 in one location and 3 in the other location, and about 5, 6 in the third location, like this.
Okay, so I would think of splitting the team up and basically saying, well, you can have one Scrum Master for each. With the current setup where we have to go through Zoom or similar tools, having that many people in a Zoom room is really difficult to manage. But even if they're in a physical room, it's not a very efficient way for them to self-organize. So for example, when I went into Commonwealth Bank of Australia, I was chief strategist and principal coach for the transformation of that bank for, well, off and on for about 8 years, but 3 years solid. And one of the programs that I coached, that I'd feel like a coach that just talks in abstractions isn't going to be very useful. One of these programs was a program, and this is not a huge, by your standards, not a huge bank. It's the biggest bank in Australia, but it's only 50,000 people, so it's tiny compared to Sberbank. Anyway, this bank had a program that was about an experimental person-to-person payments app. And it got into a really bad place. And I could tell a long story about that, but I'll tell a short story. First thing I did when I looked at what they were doing was I took their team of 18, I think, all up, and we split them into 3 little scrums. The productivity of the scrums dramatically improved, but even more important, it meant that when we needed to do some work with people who were either supplying us technical services or some of the business guys, we didn't disrupt the whole team. We were able to say, okay, well, you can talk to those guys and you can talk to those guys. It meant that all the conversations were smaller and simpler and with less artifacts. So I think that's a really good way to speed up productivity. At the same time, then you have a different problem. How do you get these people to stay aligned? And that's where the quality circles come in. If you do those once a week before retros, I'm assuming you do a weekly retro, then they stay aligned. It's really simple and there's not very much stress. If they start to go, oh, we now need to be able to make decisions about changing our ways of working and changing our priorities, we want to do that together, then there's a way to do it that involves a rotating council idea, but that's a more complicated idea. You probably don't need that.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. I hope it helps.
Коллеги, еще
Okay.
вопросы или как?
Let's say 2 more questions and we're done.
Maybe people are too shy.
That's all right. I don't bite. We can stop there if we have no further questions. It's okay.
Yeah, I guess so. If you don't mind, if any question pops up, I will share it with you. Maybe we will find an answer.
No worries. Or we could give it to one of the other X-Scale coaches so they can do some work for a change.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. No worries,
Thank you for
folks.
your time,
Well, thank you
Peter.
so much. Oh, my pleasure. It was great fun.
Так, коллеги, большое спасибо, что приняли участие. Спасибо за ваши ответы. Всем хорошего дня.
Okay, I'll stop recording. Thank you all. Take care.
Bye-bye.